The most powerful warriors, the wealthiest nobles, and the most dangerous diplomats in the galaxy lined up to win her attention. Yet she walked past every one of them and chose the man no one even considered a rival. And as the entire court held its breath, she sat beside him and took his hand. Because sometimes the greatest power doesn't shout, it simply waits to be seen. The invitation arrived in an envelope that adjusted its weight to match the importance of the event. By the time it reached my hands, it felt like I was holding a small, judgmental moon. The seal shimmered with the sigil of the Grand Interstellar Court, a rotating spiral that translated itself into every known language and a few that probably hadn't been invented yet. When I broke it open, the paper unfolded into a hovering lattice of light, and a voice announced, with theatrical gravity, that my presence was requested, anticipated, and statistically significant. Statistically significant to whom? I asked my empty apartment. The lattice did not elaborate. It merely projected a time, a set of coordinates orbiting a diplomatic station the size of a continent, and a dress code that included the phrase, ceremonial gravitas. I owned exactly 0 items labeled ceremonial gravitas. The station, when I arrived days later aboard a civilian transport that smelled faintly of recycled citrus and anxiety, hung above a violet gas giant like a jeweled crown. Thousands of vessels orbited in careful choreography, their hulls reflecting starlight in competitive flashes. As our shuttle threaded through traffic, I caught glimpses of war frigates polished to mirror sheen, pleasure barges trailing ribbons of ionized color, and diplomatic cruisers shaped like abstract sculptures that probably cost more than my entire planetary economy. I checked my reflection in the shuttle's window. My suit was dark, simple, and recently convinced to behave with a steam press. I looked like a man attending a formal debate about furniture. The grand hall received us through a corridor lined with adaptive crystal. It adjusted opacity based on the perceived ego of whoever walked through it. When a delegation of armored warriors strode ahead of me, the crystal turned nearly transparent, as if unable to contain their self-regard. When I passed, it frosted politely, perhaps out of mercy. Inside, the court unfolded in layers of engineered awe. The ceiling arced high above, a living panorama of nebulae projected through quantum lenses that captured real-time stellar events from across the quadrant. The floor shimmered with embedded gravitic threads that softened each step, ensuring no one could stomp dramatically without assistance. Along the perimeter, banners of distant systems rippled in currents of controlled atmosphere, their symbols shifting as translation algorithms whispered meanings into the minds of observers. Every species had brought its finest peacocks. A warlord from the Iron Belt stood near the central dais, his armor forged from meteorite alloy and etched with the coordinates of conquered worlds. A cluster of minor nobles orbited him like decorative moons, laughing at statements that sounded suspiciously like threats. Across the hall, a diplomat from the Sapphire Dominion rehearsed lines under his breath, his throat implants glowing as they calibrated tone for maximum seduction. A trio of mercantile magnates displayed holographic graphs of their net worth, the lines rising so steeply they threatened to leave the projection field. I located the section discreetly labeled Associated Observers and Miscellaneous Invitees, and took a seat on a bench that seemed designed to discourage ambition. It was comfortable enough, though it hummed faintly whenever someone important walked by, as if reminding me of my place in the cosmic hierarchy. "First time?" asked a small, floating sphere that hovered near my shoulder. It took me a moment to realize it was a service drone. Its surface shimmered with polite neutrality, a tray extending from its underside bearing glasses filled with something luminous and probably expensive. "That obvious?" I asked. "You have not yet adjusted your posture to convey strategic indifference," it replied. "Would you like a beverage calibrated to reduce social anxiety by 12%? I'll take one calibrated to reduce regret by 50. It paused, processing. "That formula is restricted to heads of state." I suspected as much. I accepted a glass anyway. The liquid tasted like citrus arguing with starlight. A ripple moved through the hall then, subtle but undeniable. Conversations faltered mid-boast. Holographic graphs minimized themselves. Even the warlord's laughter dropped half a decibel. I followed the direction of everyone's attention and saw her. She entered without guards announcing her lineage, without a fanfare of sonic trumpets or artificial comets. Yet the space around her seemed to realign, as if gravity had decided to be more considerate. She looked, at first glance, human, familiar proportions, familiar posture, but her skin carried the deep, luminous blue of an ocean under twin suns. Faint patterns moved beneath the surface, bioluminescent currents tracing thoughts or emotions I could not name. Her hair fell in a cascade of blonde light, catching the hall's shifting colors and softening them. And from her temples extended long, elegant ears that curved gently backward, adorned with slender silver bands that pulsed in slow, deliberate rhythm. If the rest of us were peacocks, she was the sky they were trying to impress. The warlord stepped forward first, of course. His boots struck the gravitic floor with calculated resonance. A holographic display erupted behind him, projecting a battle scene complete with orchestral accompaniment. "Lady of the Tides," he declared, voice amplified just enough to seem effortless. "Allow me to present the spoils of my most recent campaign." The projection showed ships exploding in tasteful symmetry. She watched with composed interest. "Your ships appear very flammable," she observed gently. A few nobles choked on their drinks. The diplomat from the Sapphire Dominion glided in next, bowing at an angle that probably required rehearsal. "Radiant One," he began, throat implants glowing with poetic enthusiasm. "Your presence renders language insufficient, yet I shall attempt." "Please do not strain yourself," she said kindly. He continued anyway. From my bench, I sipped my citrus starlight concoction and tried not to look as though I was enjoying the spectacle. It felt less like a courtship and more like a competitive resume reading disguised as destiny. Each suitor offered fleets, territories, genetic enhancements, or exclusive trade routes. One prince attempted to demonstrate his telekinetic prowess by lifting a ceremonial statue near the dais. The statue did not move. The gravitic threads hummed in quiet amusement. "Is it anchored?" I whispered to the drone. "For precisely this scenario," it confirmed. The prince coughed and claimed he was merely assessing its craftsmanship. She moved among them with serene patience, listening, nodding, occasionally asking questions that seemed simple but left the answerers blinking. When a magnate boasted of profits extracted from a developing world, she inquired about the world's literacy rate. When a warrior described strategic annihilation, she asked how many children had been relocated. Her long ears tilted subtly as each man spoke, the silver bands pulsing faster or slower. I had the odd impression she was listening to something beneath the words. At one point, her gaze swept the hall and, inexplicably, paused on me. I looked behind me to confirm there wasn't someone more interesting occupying my bench. There was just me and a service drone who now seemed intensely invested in polishing its tray. I lifted my glass slightly in what I hoped was a neutral gesture. Not an invitation, not a challenge, just acknowledgement. She turned back to the warlord, who was describing orbital bombardment as if it were a hobby. Minutes stretched. The parade of ambition continued. Titles accumulated in the air like dust motes. I found myself cataloging the subtle choreography of power. The way certain delegates positioned themselves closer to the central light, the way others laughed a fraction too loudly at strategic intervals. It was impressive, in its way. Exhausting, too. "Are you not participating?" the drone asked. "In what?" "In the ritual display of worth." "I left my ritual display of worth at home," I said. "It didn't match my shoes." The drone processed this, then emitted a faint sound that might have been mechanical laughter. Another ripple passed through the hall. Not the broad wave of her arrival, but something narrower, more focused. She had stepped away from the cluster of suitors. The warlord was mid-sentence. The diplomat's implants flickered in confusion. The prince glanced at the statue as if considering a second attempt. She was walking, not toward the dais, not toward the most luminous banner or the densest cluster of power, toward the perimeter, toward the bench. I felt the hum beneath the seat intensify, as if the furniture itself were reconsidering my classification. Conversations thinned behind her. Footsteps softened. Even the nebulae above seemed to dim their theatrics. I considered several options. Fleeing would be dramatic and therefore unacceptable. Standing might imply expectation. Remaining seated risked appearing indifferent in a way I did not feel. I remained seated. She stopped in front of me. Up close, the blue of her skin held layers, currents of light that shifted with her breath. Her eyes were a shade I could not easily name, somewhere between sea glass and distant storm. The faint bioluminescent patterns along her collarbone pulsed once, then steadied. "You are not presenting anything," she said. "No," I agreed. I didn't realize there would be a presentation component. A flicker amusement, perhaps, touched her expression. Her long ears angled slightly forward, the silver bands emitting a soft, synchronized glow. "Why did you come?" she asked. "I was invited," I said. The envelope was very persuasive. A pause, then, unexpectedly, she laughed. Not loudly, not theatrically. Just a brief, unguarded sound that seemed to ripple outward and collide with the expectations of half the hall. Behind her, someone dropped a glass. She studied me a moment longer, as if comparing an internal hypothesis against observable data. I became acutely aware of my hands, my posture, the faint wrinkle near my cuff. "May I?" she asked. Before I could inquire what, she sat beside me. Not across, not above, beside. The bench hummed in startled compliance. From this proximity, I could see the subtle patterns of light moving beneath her skin, responding perhaps to the ambient emotional climate of the room. Her presence did not feel overwhelming. It felt focused, as if a lens had been adjusted. The hall had gone very quiet. "I should warn you," I murmured, keeping my gaze forward to avoid provoking a diplomatic incident. "I do not own a fleet." "I am aware," she said softly. Her hand moved then, unhurried, deliberate. Her fingers brushed mine first, cool, smooth, the bioluminescent patterns flaring briefly at the contact. Then she laced her fingers through mine and held on. Somewhere across the hall, the warlord's holographic battle froze mid-explosion. The service drone beside me emitted a tiny, astonished beep. I looked down at our joined hands, then back at the nebulae unfolding above us in slow, cosmic spirals. "I assume," I said carefully, "this is the part where everyone else recalculates." Her grip tightened slightly, not possessive, not performative, steady. "Yes," she replied, "it is." For 3 full seconds, no one in the grand interstellar court remembered how to produce sound. The warlord's holographic explosion remained suspended in the air, a blossom of frozen fire reflecting in 1,000 stunned eyes. The diplomat from the Sapphire Dominion stood mid-gesture, one hand extended in what was meant to be a graceful arc of persuasion, but now resembled a malfunctioning statue. The prince who had failed to lift the ceremonial monument looked personally betrayed by gravity, and she was still holding my hand. I became aware of my pulse, steady but louder than I preferred. Her skin was cool against mine, though not cold. The faint light beneath it moved in slow, tidal rhythms. The silver bands along her long ears glowed in soft synchronization, as if marking a tempo only she could hear. "Well," I murmured, keeping my gaze forward because looking directly at the warlord felt statistically unwise. "This is subtle." "Subtlety is frequently underestimated," she replied. Behind us, the silence fractured. "That is highly irregular," someone hissed. "Surely this is symbolic." "It must be political." The warlord finally found his voice. "Lady of the Tides," he called, each word reinforced with disciplined calm. "Perhaps you would prefer a more strategic seat." "I am seated strategically," she answered without turning. A few scattered coughs attempted to disguise laughter. The service drone at my shoulder vibrated faintly, its tray trembling with suppressed commentary. The diplomat recovered next, smoothing his robes as his throat implants recalibrated. "Radiant One," he began, with the careful tone of someone stepping onto unstable ice. "While we all appreciate spontaneity, there are protocols." "Protocols are suggestions," she said gently. "Connection is not." That word moved through the hall like a software update no one had consented to download. I leaned slightly toward her. "I feel compelled to clarify," I whispered, "that I did not bribe you. I don't have bribe-level funds." "I am relieved," she replied, equally quiet. I dislike administrative paperwork. Her humor was dry, almost human. It disarmed me more effectively than the warlord's arsenal. Across the hall, a cluster of nobles began murmuring into wrist-bound communicators. I could almost see the headlines forming in real time. Markets would fluctuate. Alliances would twitch. Somewhere, a betting pool was collapsing. The warlord took a measured step forward. The gravitic floor adjusted to amplify the sound, betraying him. You cannot mean to disregard the assembled powers of this court for. His gaze flicked toward me, calculating, an observer. Associated and miscellaneous, I offered helpfully. His jaw tightened. She finally turned her head slightly, enough that her profile caught the shifting light from above. You mistake power for volume, she said. They are not equivalent. A faint murmur rippled outward. Her long ears angled subtly, the silver bands pulsing faster, then slower, as if sampling the emotional frequencies around us. I felt, absurdly, like a tuning fork beside a symphony. The diplomat attempted a smile. Surely, esteemed one, you would at least entertain the presentations prepared in your honor. I have entertained them, she replied. Extensively. A suppressed chuckle escaped me before I could stop it. She glanced at me, and for a moment the tension fractured completely. You find this amusing, she observed. I find the statue particularly compelling, I said. It has shown remarkable resilience under pressure. The prince flushed a shade that did not exist in nature. To my surprise, she laughed again, soft, genuine. The sound traveled. It did something to the air, loosening it. A few delegates who had been standing as rigid as ceremonial spears shifted their weight. You are not intimidated, she said quietly. I am, I admitted. I just don't see how that helps. Her eyes held mine for a fraction, longer than etiquette recommended. The bioluminescent currents along her wrist brightened faintly where our hands met. Most here amplify themselves in my presence, she said. Your emotional field did not. I blinked. My what? She tilted her head. My people perceive fluctuations in neural resonance. Excitement, ambition, fear, desire, they generate measurable harmonics. Yours remained steady. I assure you, I said. Internally, I am experiencing what can only be described as interpretive panic. Internally, she agreed, but you did not project it at me. The distinction settled somewhere deeper than I expected. The warlord cleared his throat with the subtlety of a collapsing asteroid. If this is some form of empathic assessment, he said, I welcome evaluation. A collective intake of breath followed. She turned fully now, though she did not release my hand. Very well, she said. He straightened, armor plates aligning with metallic precision. His emotional field, if that was the correct term, must have spiked like a star-going nova. Even without specialized ears, I could feel the intensity of his focus. Her own expression remained serene. The silver bands along her ears brightened, then dimmed. You are courageous, she said, and disciplined, and profoundly afraid. The word landed heavier than any weapon. A murmur surged through the court. Afraid. He repeated too quickly. Yes, she said softly, of being unseen. Silence returned, but this time it was different, less stunned, more thoughtful. The diplomat seized the opening. And what of me? He asked, perhaps unwisely. She regarded him for a long moment. You are fluent, she said, in every language except your own. A sound escaped the service drone that was almost certainly laughter. I shifted slightly on the bench. This is becoming an unusually honest evening. You prefer dishonesty? She asked. I prefer not being vaporized by offended dignitaries. She considered that reasonable. Across the hall, a media drone drifted closer, lenses adjusting for intimacy. Its recording light flickered uncertainly, as if unsure whether this qualified as romance, scandal, or philosophical intervention. Tell me, she said, turning back to me, her voice low enough that only I could hear over the rising whisper of the crowd. Why did you truly come? I hesitated. The easy joke hovered on my tongue, but something in her gaze suggested she would hear the distortion. I was curious, I said finally. About you, not as a prize, not as an alliance, just curious. You crossed half the galaxy to attend a court obsessed with performance. I wanted to see what you would do. And you expected this. she asked. Absolutely not, I said. I expected to leave early and complain about the refreshments. She glanced at the half-finished glass in my hand. They are mediocre. Citrus arguing with Starlight, I confirmed. Her shoulders moved slightly, a restrained laugh. Behind us, the equilibrium of the hall continued to recalibrate. Some delegates withdrew into tight circles, whispering urgent analyses. Others watched with expressions that were no longer purely competitive. A few seemed almost relieved, as if a tension they had not named was dissolving. You understand, I said carefully, that this will have consequences. Yes, she replied. You don't seem troubled. I did not come to this court to be chosen, she said. I came to choose. The simplicity of that struck harder than any grand declaration. A representative from the outer colonies stepped forward hesitantly. Lady, she said, voice steady but cautious, if your selection is not based on military strength or economic leverage, then on what metric do you rely? The hall leaned in. She looked down at our joined hands, then back at the assembly. Resonance, she said. There was confusion in the air, sharp and bright. Resonance does not conquer systems, the warlord said. No, she agreed. It sustains them. The diplomat opened his mouth, then closed it again, perhaps recalculating the persuasive value of silence. I felt suddenly conspicuous. I should clarify, I said under my breath, that I did not prepare a speech. I am grateful, she murmured. The media drone drifted closer still. For archival accuracy, it chimed in a neutral tone, does the human accept the lady's public alignment? Every eye in the hall seemed to pivot toward me. I swallowed. Define alignment. A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the outer edges of the crowd. She did not release my hand. It is not ownership, she said calmly, nor transaction, it is acknowledgement. Of, I asked. That you saw me, she replied, not the projection. Something tightened unexpectedly in my chest. I saw someone enduring a competitive talent show, I said lightly, and handling it with impressive patience. Her gaze softened. And that was enough. The warlord stepped back at last, armor dimming as if recalibrating its threat display. The diplomat lowered his hands. The prince abandoned any further interaction with the statue. The court did not erupt into chaos. It did something stranger. It paused, as if considering an alternative operating system. She leaned closer, her voice barely audible. You are still afraid. Of course I am. Good, she said. It means you understand the scale of this. And you? I asked, her long ears angled back slightly, the silver bands glowing with quiet intensity. I am exactly where I intended to be. The nebulae above shifted into a slow spiral, light cascading across the hall. Around us, power recalculated itself in hushed tones. And still, she held my hand. By the time the third wave of whispers had circled the grand interstellar court, the narrative had already splintered into a dozen competing interpretations. In one version, I was a covert operative from a rising human faction. In another, she was staging an elaborate political maneuver designed to destabilize militaristic alliances. In at least three, we were both holographic projections meant to test the court's moral flexibility. I would have admired the creativity if I hadn't been sitting at the epicenter of it. She rose first, still holding my hand, and the motion alone quieted the room more effectively than any amplified command. I stood with her, resisting the irrational urge to check whether my suit had somehow become more important in the last 10 minutes. We will speak plainly, she said, her voice carrying without force. The acoustic field in the hall adjusted instinctively, bending sound toward every listening mind. Not as symbols, not as assets, as beings. The warlord folded his arms, armor plates settling into a configuration that suggested reluctant patience. The diplomat clasped his hands, eyes narrowed in analytical interest. The prince had retreated behind a pillar, pretending to study its architectural merit. She did not release my hand. You believe, she continued, addressing the assembly, that this evening was convened so you might compete. You are mistaken. It was convened so I might observe. A ripple of discomfort moved outward. My people, she said, have been courted by empires for 3 centuries. We have been offered fleets, trade monopolies, genetic treaties, territorial expansions. Each offer was louder than the last. And you refused them all, the diplomat said. Yes. On what grounds? Asked a matriarch from the outer systems, her voice steady. On the grounds that none of them asked who we were, she replied. They asked only what we could provide. Silence again, but this time it held weight. The warlord shifted. Strength is not a flaw. No, she agreed, but it is incomplete. Her long ears angled forward slightly, the silver bands glowing as if measuring the court's collective pulse. I felt the subtle warmth of her skin against mine and unexpectedly steadied. I had arrived here as an observer, an incidental presence, a man on a bench. Now every eye in the galaxy's most powerful chamber flicked between her and me. This human, she said, and I resisted the instinct to look behind me again, did not attempt to impress me. That hardly qualifies as a diplomatic achievement, the warlord muttered. She glanced at him. On the contrary. A faint ripple of restrained laughter edged the room. He treated the service drone as if it mattered, she said. He applauded a rival's speech without calculating advantage. His emotional resonance remained stable in the presence of spectacle. The diplomat's implants flickered. You chose him because he is calm. I chose him because he is not performing. That landed differently. I cleared my throat. For the record, I am capable of performance. I simply lack rehearsal. A few chuckles surfaced. Even the prince peeked out from behind the pillar. She squeezed my hand lightly. When everyone chases, they generate noise, she said. Noise obscures signal. I sought signal. And you found it in him, the matriarch said. Yes. The warlord stepped forward once more, but there was less aggression in the movement now. And what, he asked carefully, does this mean for the rest of us? She held his gaze. It means you are not dismissed. You are invited. To what? He demanded. To listen. That word did not explode. It settled. A long pause followed. The nebulae above drifted in slow arcs. Somewhere in the upper tiers, a media drone adjusted its angle, recalibrating for a story that no longer fit its original headline. I felt something shift inside me then. Not pride. Not triumph. Responsibility. I did not come here to represent humanity, I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected. The acoustic field, traitorous, assisted me. I came because I was curious. I expected a spectacle. I found one. A few smiles flickered. But if this is about resonance, then perhaps the rest of us should admit something. The warlord's brow tightened. And what is that? That we are tired, I said, of competing at maximum volume. The admission hung there. The diplomat exhaled softly, as if a muscle he had been holding for years had finally relaxed. There are inefficiencies, he conceded. The prince stepped fully from behind the pillar. The statue is anchored, he announced defensively. The room laughed outright this time, the tension fracturing in clean lines. She turned slightly toward me. You are speaking beyond yourself. I know, I said. It's alarming. But necessary, she replied. The warlord regarded me with new calculation, not as a rival but as a variable. If this is not about dominance, he said slowly, then what do you propose? I glanced at her. She did not answer for me. Dialogue, I said. Not as prelude to acquisition, not as strategy, as exchange. The word felt fragile, but it did not shatter. The matriarch nodded. Shared research initiatives, she suggested. Cultural immersion programs. The diplomat's implants glowed more warmly now. Mutual language archives, he said, without persuasive framing. The warlord hesitated, then inclined his head a fraction. Joint defense pacts, he said, with consent. A murmur of cautious agreement spread outward. The court was not transforming into utopia in a single evening, but the axis had shifted. The service drone hovered closer. Should I recalibrate refreshments for collaborative optimism? It asked. Yes, I said, and perhaps something less argumentative. She laughed again, and this time it did not startle anyone. Hours passed in incremental recalibration. Delegates who had arrived prepared to conquer instead drafted proposals to cooperate. The holographic battle display was replaced with shared star maps. The statue remained unmoved, a monument to humility. At some point, the warlord approached me directly, without armor amplification. "You are not what I expected," he said. "That makes two of us," I replied. He studied our still-joined hands. "You understand that influence carries weight." "I do," I said, and I did, not as abstract concept, as lived fact. "You will need to grow into it," he added. "I intend to," I said. He nodded once, then stepped back. Later, as the court thinned and the nebulae dimmed to softer hues, she led me toward a balcony overlooking the gas giant below. The violet storms churned in slow, majestic spirals. "You altered the trajectory," she said quietly. "So did you." "I initiated," she corrected. "You responded." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "I almost left early." "I know." "You knew." Her long ears tilted slightly. "Your emotional resonance wavered near the entrance." I stared at the storm below. I've spent most of my life assuming I was peripheral. And now I'm reconsidering the geometry. She smiled faintly. "Power is not volume," she said. "It is coherence." "And connection," I added. "Yes." The silver bands along her ears dimmed to a resting glow. For the first time since her arrival, the air around us felt entirely unpressured. "What happens now?" I asked. "We return to our worlds," she said. "We build what we suggested. We allow this to be the beginning, not the spectacle. And us." She looked at me, not as symbol, not as example, as partner. "We continue," she said, "without performance." I exhaled, a tension I hadn't realized I carried dissolving fully at last. Below us, the storms shifted. Above us, the stars burned indifferent and brilliant. Behind us, in the grand interstellar court, former rivals drafted cooperative accords and recalibrated centuries of expectation. The warlord debated trade ethics. The diplomat removed half his rhetorical enhancements. The prince commissioned a movable statue. And I, who had arrived with a modest suit and no fleet, found that my steadiness was no longer an accident. It was a choice. She intertwined her fingers with mine once more, not as declaration now, but as continuation. In a galaxy that had measured worth by the loudest voice in the room, something quieter had taken root. And this time, no one tried to drown it out.